Macworld 1999 had two absolutely doomed gaming announcements. The first was that Halo would be coming to Mac, which... whoops! The second...
Again, our goal is to have the best game machine in the world. Now, this is another game machine. It's the most popular game machine in the world. Wouldn't it be great if we could play some of those titles too?
Steve Jobs introduces a new killer app for the Mac, a PlayStation emulator, the Connectix Virtual Game Station. Jobs hoped the software would turn the Mac into a legitimate game platform overnight by low-key pirating Sony's game library.
It is software that they're going to sell for $49 that turns your Mac into a Sony PlayStation. It plays a few hundred. It plays a few hundred of the Sony PlayStation games today.
Emulators have always been a pretty gray market. Emulation websites in the 90s were a lot like fanfics in the 90s. They all came with these watery disclaimers about how they don't own any of this, so please don't sue us. Not legally binding. So when I saw this clip, I was really surprised to see Steve Jobs on a stage just straight up repping an emulator, blatantly being out there like, thanks for the game, Sony. That's my Steve Jobs impression. This was only 5 years before this ad campaign aired, and only 8 years before this ad campaign was pirated and uploaded to YouTube. For as long as I can remember, Mac has been aggressively advertised as the productivity machine for creative types. Intel even dunked on this fact just last year in their endearingly ill-conceived I'm a Justin ad campaign.
And do we have a Mac gamer?
No one really games on a Mac.
I know.
My first instinct upon seeing that Macworld clip is that the VGS actually represents how little Jobs cared about Mac gaming. An emulator was the easiest, cheapest way to increase Mac's game library without putting too much effort in. You didn't have to woo publishers or make your platform enticing to developers. But Apple's user base was tiny in the late 90s. Game makers didn't want to waste the effort of porting their games for such a small audience. Retailers didn't want to waste shelf space for this niche little company. So an emulator was actually a pretty brilliant strategy to expand Apple's game repertoire. Despite a real visible lag, the demo of the emulator was pretty impressive. Connectix sold out of the virtual game station at Macworld. Embarrassed to say that one took me a moment to piece together, like how did they manage to sell out of a software? It's because the software was on discs, and they ran out of discs. I've not bought a piece of software on a disc since EverQuest. Up till this era, emulators weren't particularly prominent or good. There were a few fan-based emulators for older consoles, but for the most part, they weren't really comparable to the originals. And basically no emulators directly competed with a current generation console. Like the fact that the VGS had this visible lag still meant it was one of the better emulators on the market. The long and short of it is that emulators were pretty underground. But early 1999 saw a bunch of current generation, high-quality emulators drop. Aside from the Mac-backed Virtual Game Station, there was Ultra HLE for the Nintendo 64, and Bleem, which emulated PlayStation for PCs. This is like the part in Jaws where you can see the fin in the water but no blood has been spilt yet. Video game journalists waited breathlessly to see when, not if, the creators of these emulators would be sued. So, Sony sued. Of course they did. But it's not for the reasons I expected. I expected Sony to care about people not buying the PlayStation. An emulator would inevitably undercut PlayStation sales since people could just buy the games. But Sony didn't care about that. Weirdly, it would have benefited Sony if fewer people bought the console and more people bought games. The PlayStation 1, like most console hardware even today, was a loss leader. Sony actually loses money on each console sale. They do this because the real money is from selling licenses and the games themselves. So if there were, say, another audience, like Mac users, out there buying games without buying a console, that would be great news for Sony. It would expand the part of their business that is actually profitable. So why did Sony sue? Well, the PlayStation 1, like most consoles of the era, had built-in anti-piracy and region locking features. This was because of the video game crash of 1983, which almost destroyed the video game industry. Unlicensed third-party developers churned out rip-offs and cash grabs, and console developers could only watch as the market flooded with garbo bullshit. Consumers lost faith in games, and the market dried up. As a result, the industry that resurrected afterwards was really concerned with piracy and unlicensed games. It's part of the reason Nintendo still uses cartridges instead of discs. Discs are really easy to copy. And while of course I could get my best friend to burn a CD-ROM copy of Gex for me, the PlayStation's anti-piracy tech means the hardware wouldn't actually play it. Region locking had a similar purpose. Publishers pay Sony crazy stacks of money to license games for release in specific regions. If players bought games in the UK and brought them back to the United States, some publishing partners would make more money than others. And they just hated that. Sony was concerned that the Virtual Game Station could be modded to get around these anti-piracy and region locking features. And they were right, it happened immediately. Suddenly, your friend could just burn a copy of Gex 2, Enter the Gecko, and give it to you, and you could play it, and then Sony didn't get any of that Gex money. Connectix updated the software with anti-piracy measures, but it was really only a matter of time till modders broke through those as well. So it's not surprising that Sony launched a lawsuit against Connectix for copyright infringement. What is surprising is that Sony lost. In software, the functionality isn't the copyrighted aspect. The actual source code itself is the protected object. If you copy and paste the code, then yeah, that's a copyright violation. But if you take the time to write original code from scratch that does the same thing, for instance, read a Gex 3 Deep Cover Gecko PlayStation disc, then that's all fine and good. This is known as reverse engineering. This was actually established in a really important court case from 1992, Sega versus Accolade. Accolade wanted to publish Sega games without being licensed, which, again, was a thing that hardware developers were really afraid of. Sega pushed back and lost under fair use laws, effectively legitimating this reverse engineering method of software production. Connectix was able to prove that they reverse engineered the code for VGS. Their emulator was original content and therefore legal. Sony also sued Bleem and lost once again. But Sony was such an effective legal pest, Bleem eventually shut down regardless. This is to say nothing of ROMs. Ultra HLE required a ROM of a cartridge to emulate the game, so it more proactively encouraged piracy. Connectix and Bleem were in the clear because their software, as intended, still required you to buy rumored game Gex 4 Geckos Never Die in order to play it. The Ultra HLE devs wisely folded immediately upon legal threat from Nintendo, and the creators went dark on the internet. Emulators are legal, and these are the battles that set that precedent. But like a lot of stuff in the American legal system, there's a big asterisk in the corner that leads to a footnote that says if you have enough money to defend yourself. Unable to best Connectix in court, Sony gave in and just bought VGS from them. Remember, if you can't beat them, consume them. The official party line from Sony was that this partnership would expand their emulation options, but this is the last we hear from the Virtual Game Station. This was pretty much the end of the totally legal software emulation side industry. Video game console emulation still exists, obviously, but not as a real legitimate business. You can find plenty for free online, strictly for fair use game history preservation and research purposes only, of course. This moment in Macworld 1999 could have been the end of console-exclusive games. It could have changed or entirely subverted the console versus PC debates. Instead, we could have had an equally meaningless console versus PC versus Mac debates. Aww. But who needs emulators anyway when we have all these re-releases and remakes and remasters and War Masters and ports and re-releases and